French, and it warms my heart to be back at CRIMT and to hear people talking about unionized professionals, which is where I spend a lot of time. So actually the title is not exactly as it appears in the program, which is a little bit of a theme based on the sessions that I've been at so far today. Yes, the collective action among public sector lawyers is something that I've done quite a bit of work on. But now I'm moving more broadly to the legal profession in general. And what I want to describe for you today is work that is ongoing and that is sort of emerging. And there are a couple of themes that I'd like to highlight for you, and I'm going to end with more questions than answers to give us perhaps an opportunity to generate some interesting discussion later on. So I struggled with the title because I knew the title was wrong. And so this is me on the airplane. And I thought, wow, I'm going to be talking about platform work in the digital economy. And here I am in a long steel tube powered by fossilized dinosaurs, and all I had was clip art. So not exactly cutting edge, but I thought, well, maybe everything old is new again. How many of these problems that we're seeing are just manifestations of deprofessionalization, de-skilling, the industrial sort of model? And then I thought, no, CRIMT is now talking about experimentation and new regulation and re-regulation. Maybe there is something there. And of course, here is the really, really boring title I finally came up with. So what I want to talk to you about are temporary workers in the Canadian legal profession, gig work, and the regulation gap. And I think there's an interesting opportunity here to talk about collective action first and foremost, and if this is the only thing you take away from my presentation today, that would be great. I mean, I want you to take more away, but if you get this part, then that would be good, is regulation means something different in the professions that have achieved complete closure. They are regulated by themselves, for themselves, and they are the employers. So when we talk about regulation and the future of work, I think professionals is a field rich with opportunity for exploration. So the legal profession has experienced many changes in the past several decades. So increasingly lawyers in major urban centers in Canada find themselves working in large professional service firms. This is common across many of the common law jurisdictions around the world. Also, lawyers find themselves in positions in corporate counsel, in-house lawyers, and they are increasingly facing very complex ranges of legal issues that can span human rights, workplace health and safety, labor law, corporate finance, taxation, in a world that's becoming more and more complex for them. And of course, public sector legal professionals are dealing not only with the complexities of Charter of Rights and Freedoms implications in their legal files, but also with austerity measures and the fact that they are dependent employees and therefore not precarious, to use Melanie and Patrice's model, but they are suffering precarity of their professional identity. And my earlier work on occupational community shows one of the ways in which they overcome that. So it's a tremendously changing field, and it's a field in which there are implications then for education and for articling, apprenticeships, and how we then form and train and produce, socially reproduce more lawyers. And lawyers as a profession, I believe, they like to say this as well, fulfill a unique professional role in Canadian society with respect to something called the rule of law, a fundamental pillar of a democracy. It's necessary to have this professional group and that they be independent and free from political influence. The rule of law means other things as well. However, this is an important notion for these particular individuals, and therefore the regulation of their work and their workplaces becomes a very interesting question. I would like to ask for a small bit of audience participation at this point. I would like you to clap once if you have studied law. Okay, so there are a few people in the room. So Now I'm going to show you my next picture. This is my temporary lawyer, all right? So increasingly, we see a marketization of legal services. We see this traditional, autonomous, independent entrepreneur who was a man, and perhaps, precarious, self-employed situation, now, fully engaged in a traditional, managed kind of work experience. However, increasingly, due to cost pressures, legal firms are outsourcing work. And we see a rise right now in the temporary lawyer. More predominant in North America and the United States than in Canada, but it's happening everywhere. And so these are fee-for-service, contractors, freelancers. They may be in a small unit of a big, large law firm in a less expensive labor market, or they may be through Robert Half Legal Services, so a traditional temporary agency that's now hiring lawyers. So this is my picture of my gig lawyer. Again, remember, I was on an airplane with no internet and all I had was clip art, but I couldn't believe when I found this picture. I thought, this is it. He's in a privileged position. He lives in a 2-story house. He is a man. He's a white man. He's overlooking his lovely garden, which he owns. He's in his pajamas. He's wearing his big pantoufles. He's got his comfy slippers on. And if he doesn't want to get dressed and see a client today, he doesn't have to. It's a picture of leisure. This is the discourse that we see among temporary work in the professions, is that I've now achieved a position and I can pick and choose. It allows me flexibility. I can now spend the time with my teenage children who need my care and attention while I was busy building my career, which is very, very different in terms of the discourse we hear in lawyers' independent employment, particularly in the public sector, who say things such as, if I want to raise a family, we must have a 2-career income. We cannot live in the Lower Mainland if we work in Vancouver, and there are all these tremendous pressures, and we cannot say no to any file that crosses our desk. So the proposition is here that we have a stable, powerful group, this profession, powerful within the organization of their work and with tremendous power outside their professional boundaries, facing an evolving market economy, but they are very slow to change, a very conservative group. And so it begs the question, is everything old, new again? Because the ultimate gig worker is a lawyer. Lawyers work on one file at a time. One divorce, one house sale, one merger, one acquisition. I am simplifying it for all of those of you who clapped and understand that the work is a little more complex, but it is gig work. Now, the interesting market factor is that as firms get larger and larger, so do the clients, and client-firm relationships there's a power dynamic there, such that the client does control what happens to some extent. But more and more we're seeing the building of relationships. So one gig, one file leads to more work and leads to an ongoing relationship. Something that is at risk if we move to temporary freelance lawyers. They don't get that opportunity for client exchange and long-term relationships, which may mean their expertise at the heart of their knowledge work is also in jeopardy. And I think this is interesting from a CRIMT perspective because the location, the point of production in this labor process is the individual. This is knowledge work. The analysis and reflection is taking place within the individual. So it's easy to distribute that work, but when we change the work structure and the work environment, what happens to their knowledge and their accumulation of expertise? So the idea of the autonomous worker as the ideal in law had perhaps been hidden somewhat and subsumed in this push to move to the market economy. Is it now reemerging? Do we now actually see that, oh, this is great. Now we can go back and become those independent, ideal, autonomous professionals with great flexibility. So in a world where the law is becoming more specialized and more complex and more onerous with incredibly heavy workloads and long work hours and not as attractive pay, particularly in the public sector, is this an opportunity to go back and do the kind of law I thought I was going to be able to do when I was in law school, when I was trained? So we see changing structure of workplaces. We see as well changes in the nature of the work itself. So a lot of this contracted work is very monotonous, document review, very repetitive. And we're seeing a phenomenon in Europe and in the States to some extent of outsourcing the law work to other small firms or individuals or to temporary agencies. That's nearshoring, outsourcing and nearshoring. We're also seeing offshoring of legal work to other common law countries. So the environment here is changing dramatically, and when the value proposition is protection of the rule of law, neutrality and independence from government, if your workers are all over the world, how do you regulate that? In addition, digitization and a focus now on consumers and the capacity we've built to analyze big data means that you can automate a lot of the legal services that were previously provided by an individual who had to have the training and knowledge and experience of having done multiple transactions of the kind you wanted. It is the application of standard knowledge to unique situations for every client. Well, you can now step through the creation, and an algorithm will help you to draft a commercial contract. You'll have it read at the end, but you do not need to have multiple meetings with your lawyer. You can do alternate dispute resolution online now without actually ever having to see another person. So these kinds of services are shifting. What's happening in a classic Braverman sense is we are encoding the expertise into the machine. So what does that mean for this new range of workers? And I think there are lots of models, and I know in the interest of time, I won't get into a lot of it, but this is happening everywhere, right? If you or your child or your partner has an unusual rash, where do you go first? You Google it, right? Or you take a picture and you compare it to something online, which will describe for you the treatment, which you may decide to follow without ever consulting a professional because you have faith in the source of the information. The same thing is true from the consumer perspective with consumption. You used to go to the grocery store for fresh food. Now, you can ship your parcels and get your glasses and all of your prescriptions filled. You can buy your children's winter coat. So we're also moving in the world of legal employment to multi-professional firms where they will offer legal services in addition to your insurance and perhaps your real estate mortgage. So this is a world that is being fragmented in a profession that was already extremely fragmented. And we're seeing this new category of worker emerge at a time when the profession is still very slow to change, and I'll maybe end on this thought. So I want Melanie back on my team to negotiate a few more minutes, but anyway. The basis of regulation is the individual. It's an input model where the practice was traditionally solo or a partnership and now is moving to a corporate form. The focus is on financial control, protecting assets that come into a law firm, financial assets that come in and that are held in escrow and so on. As a result, those firms had to be run by a majority of legal professionals because only those inside know it best. The shift is now toward more of a measure of output. How efficiently and what is the quality of the services that are being provided, which completely changes the production process and the kinds of questions that are asked in the production of legal services, and moves from a mentor model to a management model. And through this, we get the rise of these temporary workers because it's possible to manage them without having to mentor them and develop relationships, and they don't develop relationships with clients either. It's small, segmented pieces of work, which has given rise to new discourses in the legal profession. So the two big themes are protection of the public interest and this notion of a market and efficiency and the elimination of cross subsidies. protection of the public interest often becomes, it's in the protection of the consumer. So it's a very marketized kind of discourse where we're talking about the consumption of services in some of the same ways that we talk about education, right? As beyond the liberal arts degree and its value in a holistic long-term sense. We're talking about how satisfied were you with today's lecture in one course out of 32 that you might be taking in your degree, which raises the question of who best serves the public interest. So regulation is changing is the short answer, that there is more public engagement in and involvement with regulating the industry and the profession and in dealing with complaints. And part of this is necessary for the appearance of neutrality and the building of trust and the maintenance of trust, because without that, the profession ceases to have a reason to exist, if you will. So there are lots of arguments presented for this flexibility that sound just like the same kind of arguments we hear for other kinds of temporary workers, and I'm just going to wrap up. But Eversheds, a big firm overseas, did a global survey of lawyers that revealed that those in private practice are complaining about the same things that our public sector lawyers in Canada have been complaining about. Long hours, poor pay. Interestingly enough, lack of client contact results in an increased propensity to leave the profession in the short term. So what lies ahead then for regulation in this profession as its market structure changes? You'll have to come back to CRIMT next year because we just got approval to go forward to undertake a national study of the entire profession to talk directly to lawyers about these experiences, how things are changing, and we'll bring those results back to you next year.